So today I'm going to talk about committing to an off-season phase. Now, this is something which I see a lot of people really struggle with, and I think mainly because kind of the addiction to prep is very, very real. You know, the sort of the gratification, the appraisal that comes with it, the interest and the traction that builds. You know, it's very interesting to see someone when they're, you know, very, very lean at that closer set point towards stage condition as opposed to peak off season, a little bit heavier. So I think a lot of the time people get very much addicted to that and addicted to kind of, you know, the feeling, the endorphins and the dopamine hit that comes with, you know, all of that appraisal. And this, you know, what I see firsthand is something that can quite often hold people back in terms of actually making leaps and bounds of progress in their off-season phase. So let's assume, you know, you're a competitive athlete and you're in a position where, you know, you need a lot more muscle on your frame. If you're struggling to take a sustained period of time away from actually being in prep, you're really going to struggle to make those progressions. The first thing we need to consider is if you're giving yourself, say, for example, 6 months in between shows, realistically, let's assume you was in condition. Okay, you was in shape for your last show. Realistically, it's going to take you, you know, and this is person dependent, you know, amongst a lot of different factors, but realistically, it's going to take you upwards of 6, 7, maybe 8 weeks to actually get your body into a position, you know, hormonally, metabolically, where you can actually grow. Because the stress that's going to be induced on the body throughout that dieting phase is going to be much bigger than you can actually see, you know. And immediately post-show, you start to shift some of that fatigue, you start to go out and enjoy some food again, and that stress feels as though it's relieved, but actually the stress, the internal stress on the body and what's actually going on in terms of your body's, you know, biological functions, that impact is going to, you know, leave a lag effect for a lot longer than you actually realize. So say, for example, you've given yourself 6 months between shows. You finish your show sort of back end of 1 year. You're giving yourself throughout the Christmas and winter phase to then go into a diet for, you know, the earlier shows the next year, which is not unheard of, you know, taking 6 months off season. You've then spent, let's say, for example, 2 months of that time actually getting your body back into a position where it can actually grow. It can induce muscle protein synthesis and it can actually synthesize new proteins, new muscle. You've then got 4 months in an off season. 4 months in an off season, 4 months of time to eat in a surplus, 4 months of time to be progressively overloading movement patterns to actually gain muscle. Now, in that time period, the amount of muscle you're going to gain is irrespective of genetics, irrespective of whether you're male or female, irrespective of whether you're enhanced or not, it's not going to be colossal. So if you're in a spot where you need vast amounts of muscle in order for you to be competitive or in order for you to be getting the placings that you want, you're going to need to commit to longer away from the stage. Now, if you're someone who is basic there or thereabouts, you're very close, your last show season, say for example you're trying to become a pro, say for example you're trying to get a class win and you're in the overall lineup or you're second or third and you potentially just need a little bit of refinement or your feedback was, you know, a little bit here, a little bit more detail, then a slightly shorter off season may be warranted and may be advantageous. But again, pulling back to kind of the case study, the example that we're using here, if you do need a lot of tissue on the frame, you're going to need to commit to longer. So that's not really going to be long enough. And what we need to look into as well is if you are doing show after show or prep after prep, diet after diet, that's more time in a deficit. That's more time where we're going to be potentially creating some form of metabolic damage. Let's take the example of someone who is unassisted and does not have the ability to sustain their thyroid function, their thyroid metabolism. There's going to be quite a big degree of thyroid downregulation in a dieting phase. If you're going through that process of thyroid downregulation and also your testosterone levels reducing as well, again in the case of an unassisted athlete, what you'll find is if you're then only giving yourself, you know, 6 months before you're then going into that restrictive dieting phase again, you're not giving your body long enough to actually repair the damage done hormonally. So you're not giving your body long enough for thyroid regulation to increase again. There will be some increase because thyroid typically is quite quick to bounce back. It's one of those hormones which will bounce back. However, usually it takes longer in order for that to be in a really sustainable place. And what you'll find is if you're doing long prep, short off season, long prep, short off season, the effects, the negative long-term effects that's going to have are going to be more impactful each time you go through that process. And that's why a lot of the time, take a bikini girl, for example, if you're doing a show season, you're spending 9 months of that year doing show after show after show, there's going to be some thyroid downregulation there. there's going to be some impact on those natural levels of testosterone and estrogen. If you're then only spending a very short period of time in a gaining phase, you're then going back into that with a little bit of lag carried over from that last show season. You're doing that process again, and then going into that next show, you're carrying a little bit of lag still. And eventually that's going to start to cause some damage metabolically. And that's why a lot of the time you see if an individual has gone through a show prep one season and it's been a long show prep, or they've been on very restrictive calories, high cardio, where it's going to be causing high amounts of stress, they then have a relatively short off-season phase. They then go into that next prep and they find that it's a completely different story. Body fat's just not coming off the same way. You're having to fight harder and do more to get the same effect. And each time you do that, it'll get harder and harder until you can commit to the phase of having an off-season, having a long productive off-season. Okay, so that's the metabolism side of things, the thyroid downregulation, estrogen, testosterone. Now, of course, when in the case of an assisted athlete, we have different pathways that we can explore in order to kind of keep hold of thyroid function. Of course, T3, T4. We can keep hold of testosterone levels, of course, taking exogenous testosterone amongst other androgens. And there's different pathways that we can look to synthesize as well from synthetic performance enhancing drugs. However, there's still going to be an impact in terms of synthesizing those pathways over a long duration of time, whilst going against that with obviously the effects of prep. There's still going to be some ramifications of having a short period of time and not allowing those either natural levels to come back into a good place, or have periods of time relying on less of the exogenous drugs in order to keep those levels in a good place. So either way, there's still going to be some negative impact of not taking long enough away from the reliance of the exogenous hormones. So taking time away is going to help metabolically, hormonally. We also need to consider that the longer we can spend in a gaining phase, actually getting body weight up, actually eating more food, the longer we can be strong. There's no secret to being heavier and eating more food strongly correlates to being stronger in the gym. And that's the reason why a lot of the time when you come out the back end of a dieting phase and you're very light and your food intake is very low, stress is high, of course, accumulation of these things, your performance is just on the floor. And then you get a few meals in, you start to get food up, you start to get body weight up, strength comes back. When you are heavier, your ability to leverage movements improves. Let's take a dumbbell chest press, for example. Have you ever realized towards the back end of a prep, you're telling your coach you just can't stabilize the dumbbells anymore because you're light. There's less fat around the joints, there's less leverage. So Charles Poliquin said you can't fire a cannon out of a canoe, and this is a great metaphor, if you like, for how when you are heavier, you can stabilize these movements much better. You can't fire a cannon out of a canoe, but you can fire a cannon out of something which is sturdy in the ground and heavier. So once you're at heavier body weight, your ability to do the big movements that we know are going to build muscle is better. Your ability to leverage a hip hinge once you're heavier is better. So there is a lot of merit to spending time being heavier, having more body fat on you, having more body fat around the joints to make the joints feel more supple. There's a lot of merit to having food intake and body weight higher. Now the problem is, we can't just get there like that, because if you go out of a contest prep and say, right, I need 50 pounds on it, I need it now. I need my food to be 6,000 calories and I need it now. If you chase that very quickly, your body's not going to be able to deal with that vast increase in adiposity. Your blood pressure is going to go through the roof. You're going to feel like crap. Your sleep's going to be awful. Digestion is going to be awful. And you're going to have to diet before you get anywhere near that set point. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here, guys, and I hope I'm doing it, is that to get to that heavier set point where you're heavier, your food intake is higher, you're stronger, takes time. What we need to ensure is that we're getting, each time we increase food, we're getting that metabolic leverage, so your body is then utilizing that food. Then we increase a bit more food, your body's metabolically utilizing that food. If we just bridge that gap and add it all in one, there's absolutely zero chance of getting that metabolic upshift, and your body's not going to utilize it, and you're going to feel terrible. So it takes time to get to that point. I've seen individuals get up to 5,000, 5,500, 6,000 calories, maybe more in an off-season phase, but it's taken us 12, 18 months. It's taken time to get to that. And in between that stage, we might have little mini cuts at certain points as well, but in general, we're still in that upwards trajectory. So the longer you can commit to a gaining phase, the longer you can spend getting your metabolic rate up, allowing you to eat more food, getting your body weight higher, but being able to sustain these higher levels of food in terms of digestion, in terms of how you feel, in terms of the metabolism. So longer durations in a surplus is going to be more advantageous. And then we just had to look at the fact that above everything, building muscle takes time. Everyone wants to, make massive changes. I'm going to come back unrecognizable. I'm going to come back, a different person with 10 pounds of muscle. And it's like, don't throw that around, that 10 pounds of muscle. Don't throw that around if you're ready to commit to the time it takes to add that sort of muscle tissue, especially if you're already quite advanced. If you're very early in your training age, or you've just started performance enhancing drugs, or a combination of the two of those things, I've overlooked phases with clients where you've added 10, 15 pounds of muscle in a relatively short period of time. But if you're already assisted or not going down that route of assistance, or you're later on in your training career or training age, don't expect to be making those kind of jumps in muscularity if you're not committing to the long term. Okay, guys, and if you need serious development to your physique to come back and be competitive, or to be ticking the box of what you're trying to achieve in your competitive career, commit to the longer term. Doesn't have to be 5 years, but you may need to take 12 months. You may need to take 18 months if you're trying to make those big step forward in your physique development. Okay, guys, so that's committing to an off-season phase. If anyone has any questions of that, as always, I'll be happy to answer in the comments box below, and we'll see you in the next one.